Welcome to the Rob Call Bottom Up Show. It's available on YouTube, on Pacifica Radio Network, on Progressive Radio Network, on iTunes, on Stitcher, on SoundCloud, and more. I'm pleased to have as a guest on this show George Goehl, who is the director of People's Action and the People's Action Institute, a federation of community-based organizations across the country that bring poor and working class people together to win economic and racial justice. The website for People's Action is peoplesaction.org, and George's last name is spelled Goehl. So it's great to have you here. Thank you for making this.
Yeah, I'm excited to sit down. This is a great way to spend an hour today, so looking forward to it.
Great. So I was inspired to contact you because you wrote an article for The Guardian that basically said the secrets to Democrats winning the Midwest is to fight big agriculture. And I think that, I mean, I really like that idea. And one of the reasons I like it is because I think that big, just about anything should be the target of activism and of grassroots bottom-up organizations.
Yeah.
And so, and then I read it, and I read a previous one you wrote about these factory farms. I mean, and really, it comes down to a lot of pig poop.
Yep.
Or cows. I mean, it stinks in reality, not metaphorically.
That's right, for sure. Yes.
And so you've been out there in the rural areas talking to people, and factory farms are a strong issue.
Yeah, definitely. I'll say this, like coming out of the 2016 election, we went and knocked on 2,000 doors and had conversations with rural folks. And then we went to, 8,000 more people, but we released a report after the first 2,000 conversations. And these were really listening conversations. We weren't there to push anything or mobilize people around anything, just a sense that people needed to be heard. And we wanted to hear them. And we asked 3 questions. What issues are you most concerned about? What do you see as the solutions to those issues, which was to our effort to not project a progressive solution onto the issue, like what they think the solution is might be different than what we think it is. And third, who and what do you think is responsible for what have been declining conditions in the community? And clean air and water came up as the number 3 issue. And that was fairly consistent across states. And the number 1 clean water issue that people identified was the influx of factory farms in their communities. And people felt that in many ways, neither party had really stood up to corporate agriculture in the way that was needed, and instead had been bought off by corporate ag, allowing for an explosion of factory farms, particularly in some states that we were in, like Iowa, Minnesota, Wisconsin, North Carolina, and the impact that these factory farms have on the local community, just from a health perspective. And Iowa has 767 impaired waterways. There's 3 million people there, but 10,000 factory farms. And if you go out in the community, I mean, you can just actually smell hog shit everywhere in the communities. And so people actually hanging out on their front porch isn't a thing, or drinking the water that would come through their waterways isn't a thing. So it's a huge issue for people, and one that they see a lack of any kind of political leadership on.
I'm just trying to do the numbers. I mean, how many people does a factory farm employ?
Oh, I mean, I'm very small number. If you would go out to a factory hog farm that maybe, let's say, had 10,000, 50,000 head of hogs, you might see 2 people working there. It doesn't mean there's only 2 employees, but so much of those operations are automated. There are things people need to do, like if a bunch of hogs die, somebody's got to get them out to the dumpster. I mean, I've been out there. I could send you photographs of, 50 hogs in a dumpster. Somebody had to do that job. There are jobs that need to be done, but they're not big job creators.
So 10,000 factory farms, not 100 times, not 100 employees with 1 million out of 3 million Iowans. It's 30,000, 50,000 jobs, maybe.
If that, it's not a big job producer for the community.
So who would be happy if and how do you deal with them? What are the political steps that need to be done to deal with them?
Well, one of the big pushes happening in Iowa and other states is actually is a moratorium on factory farms. So basically, in Iowa, just to recap, you got 3 million people, 26 million hogs, and 10,000 factory farms. And those hogs produce as much waste as 65 million people in a state of 3 million. So it's a dire situation in Iowa and other states. And
Yeah.
so, yeah, it's really, as Cherie Mortiz from Iowa CCI Action Fund says, like, that's too much corporate hog shit for one state. And so the push in Iowa is for a moratorium on factory farms until they move towards local control, where the decision would be at the county level, whether that factory farm was allowed to come into the county or not. And after a point that you'd got to fewer than 100 impaired waterways in Iowa, where right now it's at 767 waterways. So that would be the benchmarks you'd have to hit to then say, okay, the moratorium is over. And there's similar demands like that in other states across the country, but every state doesn't have the exact same kind of policy proposals.
That doesn't seem like a very ambitious policy, frankly.
Yeah, I think you're right, and I think people want to think bigger, but have been really beaten down by the kind of concentration of power that so many industries have in the economy and at the state policy level, and corporate ag certainly in these states like Iowa, Minnesota, Wisconsin, North Carolina, and others.
And big ag is gigantic, huge, massive in terms of its power.
Yeah.
And it's really just a handful of companies that are at the top of that pyramid, right?
That's totally like actually most industries in America now. Yeah. I think they've figured out how to aggregate and accumulate power, starve out competitors. And I think figured out how at different levels to kind of buy part ownership of both political parties, which has really kind of prevent us to getting to any kind of majorities in state legislatures to regulate the factory farm industry.
Is this something that could be done at a federal level?
I think there are definitely federal fixes. There are federal policy proposals being moved around. I mean, I will say in our work, we definitely had a lot of engagement with Senators Sanders and Warren and Julian Castro and Senator Booker. They all have embraced the idea of a factory farm moratorium in states that have a bunch of factory farm states like Iowa. And a number of those candidates, Sanders and Warren, we've worked the most closely with, kind of building out what would be like kind of economic and racial justice rural agenda for America. So I think more engagement around just rural generally, and thinking about that through a federal policy level. But also, I think real far way to go from where we need to be.
What about the Green New Deal? Where's that fit in?
I think, there's a bunch, the Green New Deal is a bit of a kind of template, of which you can fit a lot of stuff in. So there's a lot of work just as a kind of an aside to move like housing into a Green New Deal, whether that's through kind of green new low-income housing, retrofits and other things. There's definitely pushes to move kind of a more like sustainable agricultural policy into the Green New Deal. So I think there's like a strong intersection, and the Green New Deal can be a vehicle for moving ideas and policy. And it's still, I think, kind of like it's a working draft that's a little different every day.
Yeah, and I know it's really in its early stages of development, but are there is there anything in the Green New Deal about big ag and factory farming?
Yep. It's getting put in there all the time. And I think the intersection, a number of the groups that organize kind of family farmers in states are collaborating around Green New Deal work, organizing events with Sunrise, the organization that really kind of moved the Green New Deal conversation to a whole new level. So I feel really hopeful about that kind of intersectional approach where you have different campaigns coming together. So I think there's a sense that we're going to have to figure out also, if you want to move a policy like the Green New Deal, you're going to need rural voters to get behind it. And I would say for the last 20, 30 years, the Democrats and progressives have largely not had a rural strategy. And I think we're steadily starting to see some people realize that's a big mistake.
Now, this is a drum you're beating, is that we need to really have conversations with rural people, and we need to start working towards bringing them policies that get them to embrace progressive politics. So now you you say the answer is to fight big agriculture. How do you do that? What does that actually involve at a grassroots level? What do you say to people who live in small towns and rural America?
Specifically around corporate ag, or just generally around?
No, around that's the issue that you say is the big issue. So around corporate ag.
Yeah, I would say it's one of the big issues. I want to come back to a couple of the other ones that we're hearing on the door knocks, but I think people are coming together. So, I get reports from some of the Midwestern states of, the prospect of a factory farm being built in a county that doesn't have one or already has too many. And you will have hundreds of local folks show up. And oftentimes a majority of the group are Republicans, looking for answers, leadership, and ways to stop the factory farms. So, but I think what you're going to have to do is have a big investment in organizing folks to come together. A lot of the policy proposals are on the table, but you're going to have to break up the corporate stranglehold on state legislatures and the governor if you want to do that. And I would say, I just think there's not been enough investment in building capacity in rural communities. So most of the organizations I know that have built kind of economic, racial justice, progressive, whatever you want to call it, organizing capacity in communities, rural communities, have figured out how to do it on their own dime, by hook or by crook. There's not been the level of support there for that work. Figure out how to pass the hat, how to create a culture in the organization of people pitching in. But it's been really thin. And so we're basically trying to rebuild that organizing power and infrastructure, not in all states, but in many states from scratch. So I think we're going to have to do that. And corporate ag will be one of the issues that really come up and resonate. Like I said, it was number 3 in our surveys, but it won't be the
What
only.
were number 1 and 2?
Number 1 was healthcare, and far and away, and crossed every state. And number 2 was education, which we didn't completely expect. Number 4 was addiction, mental health, and number 5 was jobs. Those were the, and then we have just completed 10,000 conversations, and we'll release a report soon. But largely, those trends continued over the.
Right, so let's stay with big ag. You've got hundreds of Republicans showing up when they're looking to add another one of these massive pig farms, where factory farms where tens of thousands of pigs produce millions of pounds of fecal matter that are often stored in lagoons, right?
Right. Yeah.
And another thing that happens is you have flooding. You have massive leaks and that's where you've got these 700 plus watersheds that have damaged or ruined, really, right?
Yeah.
So I want to hear more about the conversations. What do you say to these people that gets them to go, maybe I shouldn't be voting for these right-wing guys who are supporting the corporations? And of course, the other problem is you've got Democrats to support the corporations too.
Well, I think that's the big conundrum until I'm not saying all of those, let's say 150 Republicans that came to a meeting are like up for grabs for the Democratic Party, but I think some are. But there's very little, Democratic Party leadership saying like, we're ready to go toe to toe with corporate ag, and we think we got to downsize this and kind of, basically bust up what in many ways are monopolies, and also clearly institutions that are not, making the community healthier or really kind of rebuilding their economies. So, but I think until you have like strong, hardcore Democratic Party leadership on these issues, the differential between the two candidates in any legislative district is not big enough. And I think that's what groups like some of the best groups that organize around this, Missouri Rural Crisis in Missouri, Land Stewardship Project Minnesota, and Iowa CCI in Iowa, I think, have a handful of like strong Democratic Party leaders on these issues, but they're actually more the exception than the norm. And I'll just say one more thing on this. I think like kind of bigger than the corporate ag thing that I think is a problem with that is I think like decades of Democrats, and not all Democrats, but a lot of Democrats, lack of willingness to name the true villain in what's happening in a community or in a state or in our country, whether that is corporate ag or the big banks or big tax dodgers. has really left open this space for the right to inform and insert a villain. And they've, in most cases, inserted people of color, immigrants, Muslims, Jews, basically othering other people and saying this is the reason for the problems in your community. And in many of the narratives of Democrats, I'd say that's less the case today, but over the last 30 years have not really been willing to name that there is a villain in this story, and it is concentrated corporate power. And because of leaving that vacuum, you've left a huge space for the other side to inform how people are making meaning of what in many cases are declining conditions in their community.
Well, I just recently had Matt Stoller as a guest
Hmm.
on, and he wrote a book, Goliath, that talks all about how the approach to monopoly has just really withered over the last 50 years. And starting in the 70s, we shifted, so we stopped standing up to monopolies, and we
Right.
have to start doing that again. And
That's right.
and I write in my book, Bottom Up Revolution, that we need to have a science of small. We need to
Mhm.
support think tanks that look at ways to prevent industries from getting too big, and that look at ways to discourage industries that are too big from staying that way.
Yeah.
And that means giving tax incentives to small businesses, small farmers,
Hmm.
and giving tax disincentives, discouragement to the biggest
Yeah.
companies. So I'm going to ask you again, if oh, I didn't exactly ask it, but
Okay.
if you shot for the stars, not the moon, the stars, when it comes to dealing with big ag, what would it look like in 10 or 20 or 50 years if there was a successful approach
Hmm.
to eliminating big ag as a problem?
Right. I think we've talked a little bit around what you got to do on the kind of regulation side, to bust up the monopolies, kind of downsize these organizations. But I feel like on the other side, you have to be like, what is there an investment in a more local, small, sustainable agricultural policy and in communities? And to some extent, building a new version of what would be much more of a family farm and sustainable agricultural economy. And I think we need to do that on everything, whether that's kind of banking or other issues. How do we move to more small and local? And I hope that's one outcome of this kind of interesting reinventing capitalism conversation that seems to be happening around the country, is which is actually, like, largely, I think, starting to become a mainstream conversation. I'm always amazed when I'm at the airport and look at the magazine, and I'm like, there's like five mainstream magazines raising questions about capitalism. I think that's a good sign. But I don't think we've, at this level, have the kind of organizing and positioning around the new local, small, new economy ideas that we need, that people like, David Korten and others in the Democracy Collaborative and Gar Alperitz and some of those folks lift up.
Yeah, I two great people, and yes. So, uh, but I want more details from you. I mean, what would it look like in 50 years if we got rid of it? So I think what I'm hearing you saying is we have small family farms. What I understand is that monoculture, the big use of massive amounts of land to produce one crop, is very unsustainable, and it's not healthy,
Mm-hmm.
and it produces food that's less nutritious. And when you think about these factory farms with the pigs, and I was reading your articles about them, and they get these huge runoffs that force people to filter their water in much more expensive ways. You describe in one of your articles how in Iowa they have this huge what is it?
It's the
Describe that.
largest nitrate removal system in the world. Yeah.
Yeah. So and the Iowans are paying for that.
Right.
Yeah, and that is not something that they should be paying for. The
Right.
factory farms should be paying for it big time, but they get away with not paying for that, not paying for all the damage that does when there's floods. Where else are there farms like that floods are really producing damage?
Well, one real issue has been in North Carolina, and kind of following Hurricane Florence. So there are these big, manure lagoons that a lot of the manure is stored in. Then you have some kind of weather disaster like that come through and like move all of this manure out of the lagoons and then into the waterways and ways. So which will be, particularly an issue in communities that are close to coast, will be a bigger issue. And as climate change continues to be up on us. So that's another, I mean, in North Carolina as a state, if you ever looked at a map of like the factory farms in the state, particularly in the southern part of the state, the level of concentration is crazy. They have more hogs than than people in the state of North Carolina.
Well, in Iowa, it's 3 million people, 65 million hogs. Is it a
Yeah,
similar proportion in North
it's
Carolina?
something big like that. Those are two of the states that have had some of the larger issues, particularly for their size as states.
So when they have these manure lagoons, and then there's a weather thing that happens, what do the factory farms do? Do they go, oops, sorry, you guys can go clean it up, or are they accountable for cleaning it up, or what happens then?
Yeah, I think it depends on the state and the regulation, but in most cases, these guys are not regulated in any real serious way. I mean, I think there's some baseline regulations. If there's organizing and accountability, people will be forced to clean it up. But I mean, in many cases, corporate ag runs the state house. And so, they'll do what they got to do to keep their brand in place, but there's just not very many laws that really like stick it to these guys and hold them accountable. And so, I mean, this is where we're getting into big money in politics is like one of the most critical issues of the day. Like I think you're going to either need some version of like kind of how Bernie describes a political revolution of enough people just deciding enough is enough. You're probably going to need a combination of something like that. And then I think as we think about 2021, whether that's at the state level, at the federal level, you've got to move structural reforms that rebalance the power relationship between big corporations and everyday people. And so I think, let's say, a Democrat wins in 2021, and let's even say somehow has the House and the Senate. I'd be thinking about the combination of policies that like significantly and demonstrably improve people's lives because people are hurting and need, and move some structural reforms that reorganize the relationship between everyday people and consolidated corporate power. Otherwise,
Well, that's really vague stuff. And I want to state you're focusing on rural people. I mean, you're doing urban and rural, but you have experience talking to 10,000 rural people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think that's invaluable. So let's say, we get into 2021 and it's the off year elections of state representatives. And one of the things that I see you talking about as an issue is safe and clean water. Mm-hmm. And it's not just what's happening in Detroit, it's happening in 30 some metropolitan areas. And from what I'm hearing, it's rife in farm areas because of this big agri, because of these factory farms. I mean, how often do they have these leaks and disasters? I mean, are there stats on that?
There may be. I don't have them memorized for you, but I think like it really depends. I mean, some of the stuff around weather disasters is newer and starting to become more kind of prescient with the kind of climate change and some of the hurricanes and whatnot. Less of an issue in maybe some of the Midwestern states where you're not having that level of storm. So, but there's been a lot written about what happened, with Hurricane Florence and in North Carolina, and that is an issue. Food and Water Watch, you might want to have somebody on from there who could go into great detail around how that's showing up in issues. I will say, just as likely we will hear, in addition to factory farms and corporate agriculture, one of the things we'll really hear from rural folks is fracking as an issue that's impacting or could impact the water quality, and just, kind of random set of like toxic spills. And a lot of times they're kind of less infrastructure in terms of being able to regulate and monitor some of that stuff. So the exact cause of the water quality issue in rural communities was not always corporate agriculture, though it was the primary one, at least for the states we were in.
Well, you mentioned that there are over 700 different water sources that have problems in Iowa. What caused those problems?
Largely runoff from either pesticide or hog manure.
Does that happen with small farms, with small family farmers?
It could. I mean, it can happen anywhere, but you wouldn't usually have, kind of 10,000 hogs in one area, and that level of kind of concentration. I mean, if you would, visit one of these factory farm things, the number of hogs you fit together in one area is like intense. Where with a family farming model, you're not actually like trying to like concentrate as many hogs as possible per square foot. That's not the kind of model of farming that people are doing.
I mean, it seems to me that family farms would be able to integrate all that poop into fertilizer, into growing crops, and
people have done for a long time, right?
maybe while they're at it, using non-GMO crops as well. So we can deal with
Right.
Monsanto Bayer while we're at it, another thorn in the side of progressives.
Yes. Yep. Totally agree. I think that's right.
Man, but it seems to me like there needs to be a big picture. There needs to be some kind of leadership, and it seems like you're kind of taking a stand on this. I mean, are there organizations that are coming together, coming up with a big green farm deal? I mean, it sounds like that's what is needed. That people
Yeah.
create a collection of visions of what is possible and start saying, this is what we need to do, and asking politicians, what are you going to do about it?
I can tell you what we're doing, like for sure, is I think like trying to build an overall rural strategy. And one key part of that out of these 10,000 conversations is creating a rural, like an overall rural agenda that we try to move, and of which agriculture would be one component. And you'll talk to some folks, in kind of rural communities and like want to talk about agriculture all the time. And then the other folks are like, seems like that's the only conversation anybody, politicians and others want to have. And there, we have all these other full life issues that we deal with that have nothing to do with ag. So like healthcare, like the opioid crisis, job quality, education, the kind of distance to any kind of opportunity to different things like that, to healthcare. So those are the issues. So I think people want an overall agenda that they help develop, and then we will organize around that agenda. I think separately, you actually have to build, and I sense I'm not getting specific enough for you on this, but like you have to build like organizations in communities, or we can talk about all the big policy ideas we want till we're blue in the face. You actually have no political power in a community or in a district to be able to move your member of Congress or your state rep or state senator. And if you don't, so if you can't move them, we want to unelect them. But you actually, right now, you have a huge swaths of the country that have no local institutions that are designed to do that. And so, I think meanwhile, if you're a corporate ag or a big health insurance company, you don't need an institution in the community. You need somebody at the state house that's passing around checks, and then you've got that. So we believe like we can talk about all this other stuff till we're blue in the face. If we don't go out, listen to people, find out what issues people want to work on, and in many cases start by organizing locally around the issues that people have identified. And that is super important. Like we made a decision in this project to not come in and sell something. Like, okay, here in this county, in Alamance County, North Carolina, you identified, water as an issue like that you want to work on. We're going to work on that. If we go to Haywood, North Carolina, people said wages are the issue. We're going to work on that. In many cases, trying to find something we might be able to achieve in the first 6 months or a year, because so much about political life in America has taught people like to become cynical, to give up, that it won't matter, it won't make a difference. And we have to figure out how to convince people that it will make a difference. So by listening to people, working on the issues they identify, often local in nature at first, and winning stuff, then people are like, hey, maybe I should come to the next meeting. Maybe it's worth giving up a night or two a week to help build this organization. But just breaking through that cynicism is critical. And then I'd say, secondly, the other issue in here is like, we're dealing with a lot of folks who've been, sold a bill of good by Fox News and Rush Limbaugh. I grew up in rural Southern Indiana for the first part of my childhood. And I remember all my life growing up in Indiana, you turn on the radio and Rush was on, and you go in the barbershop and Fox was playing. Like, we've got to get in there and help people make meaning of.
Okay, so we need to take a brief break.
Yeah.
Show ID. It's a little pause.
Oh, yeah.
So I can edit it in the bumpers for the radio show.
Yeah, sure.
10 seconds. And my guest for the show is George Goehl. He's director of People's Action and People's Action Institute, a federation of community-based organizations across the country that bring poor and working class people together to win economic and racial justice. And we're talking particularly about rural America, how we can organize them. So, I've been involved recently at the local level with Power Bucks County. It's a spinoff of the Power Philadelphia, and it's an organization group that is built around organizing communities of faith.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not a member of a community of faith, but I really like what they're doing. And what they've done is they started a series of conversations trying to get an idea from, it works out to a couple dozen communities of faith of all different kinds. What are the issues that people care about? And so that was the first step. And I think that's
Mm-hmm.
exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Find out and identify what the local issues are that people care about. Does your organization work at all with communities of faith? I'm curious.
Yeah. It's not our primary organizing model, but it's something we definitely do in parts of the country. Yeah.
Because I would think in rural America it could be very
Oh, yeah.
powerful.
Totally.
Yeah.
Totally. Yeah.
So you've done 10,000 conversations. What do they look like, those conversations? How do they happen?
Sure. In most cases, that happen on a front porch. Knock on somebody's door and identify the local organization. So we're like you said, a federation of local organizations from across the country, and just we're out talking to folks in the community about the issues they care about and what they want to see happen. And this is basic kind of community organizing done well. This is how you start. And in this specific project, because we wanted to learn as much as possible and track the conversations as well as possible, we did ask these three questions, and of what issues are you most concerned about? What do you see as the solutions? And then kind of who and what do you think is responsible for why things are the way they are, which was our attempt to really understand how people are making meaning of what in most cases are declining economic and social conditions. And I will say it wasn't exclusively, but we definitely went to a large number of Obama to Trump counties. So counties that have, supported Obama once or twice and then swung to Trump. The greatest concentration of those counties is along the Mississippi River in Iowa and in Wisconsin, and kind of bleeds up into Minnesota and down into Illinois. But we went to counties like this across the country. We also did pick a set of counties. It wasn't a hard criteria, where there was actually a visible rise in white nationalist organizing. You were actually white nationalists were mobilizing in some way at the county courthouse or in some more public way than had been the case previously. And then we went out and had these conversations, and I think people, by and large, kind of across the political spectrum, and we didn't try to target Democrats or independents or Republicans. We just went to the doors in the community we were in and talked to everybody.
And you just had an article that was published that you wrote in the New York Times titled, "If Progressives Don't Try to Win Over Rural Areas, Guess Who Will?" And the subtitle is, "I've been out there organizing for 20 years. I've never seen this level of public activity by white supremacist groups."
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So you're seeing that out there.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. We were seeing it when we picked some of the places that we went to. And then I've been out canvassing in a number of these states, doing this door knocking and listening, and we're driving by the, Pittsburgh, town square, and somebody's like, "Oh, come back in an hour," which we did. They'd be 15 white nationalists out there rallying around a Confederate flag. And they do that, regularly. And, go to some other state and there's a big flyering campaign, by the White Knights of the KKK. So it kind of depends on the place. But, I've been, doing organizing for over 20 years. I travel all across the country. This has not been a thing we've really seen in this way.
Is it working?
What, they're organizing, or?
Yeah.
I don't know. I think it's I don't know if it's working yet. I don't think we really know if it's working. I think we know that it's scary. I think we're also tracking ways that kind of more make America great again slates are electoralizing. So people that are maybe, not wearing hoods or, running around with Confederate flags, but in many ways are running a kind of anti-immigrant pro-gun agenda, and are actually running for elected office. So trying to track locally how you have kind of versions of Trump showing up at the local level. But I think generally, and the point of that article is, if we're not present to help people make meaning of changing economic conditions and changing demographics, like others are going to be. It might be the Klan or a different white nationalist group. It might be Fox News, Rush Limbaugh, the local electeds. But I actually think we don't give rural folks enough credit. 33 to 49% of, those counties we see when we look at a electoral map that's full of red, like do vote Democrat. They're doing that despite, in many cases, living in a very conservative and oftentimes racist surround sound. The biggest mobilizations, or the largest number of mobilizations around families belong together, the crisis at the border, those were mobilized by rural communities and counties that went by Trump. So I think there's a lot of kind of like stereotyping and writing off of rural communities by progressives and urban elites. And I think I think we're better than that. And I think it's bad strategy.
And can I cite a little bit from your article?
Yeah, sure.
So many of these places need organizing to win improved conditions. Despite the stereotypes, rural people are not static in their political views or in the way they vote. Single white rural women and young rural white people represent two of the greatest leftward swings in the 2018 midterms, moving 17 and 16 points respectively toward Democrats. They played a key role in Democratic wins across the Midwest. That's encouraging.
Yes. Yeah. Encouraging and actually like underreported, I think, like that specifically the 17 and 16 point swings of single rural white women and young rural white folks, I think it's a very big deal. And a lot of those happened in some of the key like Midwestern states. A lot of that happened in Obama to Trump counties that people swung back. Yeah.
So tell us more about your conversations. How many people did those 10,000 conversations?
How many people? Around 100 or so. And it was a mix of staff and volunteers that did that. One really interesting thing that happened after Trump was elected, I got my first call the day after the election of a very talented organizer from New York City who decided it was time to move to rural North Carolina where her mom was and kind of, in her words, like organize her people. And so we started to help. It wasn't big, but it was a little mini migration of people who'd left rural communities, moved to cities, and got jobs, became really well-trained organizers, and decided they wanted to move back home. And we figured out how to, in many cases, very small little grants to help people figure out how to get back home and build these new organizations. And they were the kind of anchors of this listening process. And I would say one of the most hopeful groups, and definitely worth your viewers and listeners checking out, is Down Home North Carolina, which is one of these groups. There are a number of them that sprouted up in the kind of aftermath of the Trump election.
Down Home North Carolina.
Yeah.
Now, I was looking at the list of members that you have. You've got about 40 or so different organizations. Right. And a lot of them are, I think in Pennsylvania you have Keystone Progress Education something or other.
Mm-hmm.
What a lot of them are like education have in their title. What are they about?
All those groups, or
yeah.
These are all community organizations that are multiracial, low-income and working class people, in many cases trying to do a mix of urban, suburban, and rural, like figuring out who do you need to bring together across the state to change what's feasible. And so that might mean you need to be in Aurora, Colorado, or Greeley, as well as in Denver. And so organizations do that. And in all cases are multi-issue organizations. So really work on the issues that are kind of popping for people in that era in time. People's Action 10 years ago, we had 80% of our energy and capacity was focused on the financial crisis. Like that's what we were organizing because that's where our people were at. And so the best organizing, just like the work you referenced, I think in Pittsburgh, starts with listening. And
not Philly. It was in Philly.
In Philly, right.
County.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So it changes what we end up working on depending on what the folks are saying. And that gets to your bottom up thing. There's also an organizing model, which is where a bunch of people sit around in a national office and cook up an idea around we should definitely be working on X issue, or the funders want us to work on X issue, and let's go get some people out in the community to work on X issue. We think that's actually kind of morally off. We think it's actually bad strategy. It doesn't work. It might. And we think there's a little bit of go slow to go fast in a bottom-up model. Like we got to put the time into going out to listening, to understanding where people are at, and then together, democratically build a strategy around those campaigns and governance structures. Takes a little longer on the front end, but things things become really powerful if you
Where
stick with it.
where were those porches that you went to?
Sure. Well, I'll just say most recently, I was in Alamance County, North Carolina, and which is, roughly, I'm going to get the numbers, I'm going to be exactly right, roughly a 60 some percent white, and the remaining being African American and Latino community, the kind of former textile mill stronghold. In around the Harrisburg area in Pennsylvania, kind of in working class neighborhoods, and then up in the Thumb in Michigan,
Oh,
like.
well, let me hear about, I'm in Pennsylvania. So tell me about what happened there and what you learned and what you heard and what you concluded.
Yeah, sure. I think we learned, like healthcare just shows up as front of mind for voters across the political spectrum.
What about it?
Just actually the lack of, the inability to afford it, the complications of the system, the stuff around pre-existing conditions. It's actually, there's a range. I will say it's not just like one thing, but just like healthcare is front of mind. And I think that's a combination of like the impact of health in people's lives and the health in a really hard to navigate and expensive healthcare system. And I do think because it's been a national debate and conversation, people are more accustomed to talking about it. I
Okay,
do
so
think
did you have conversations with specific people about healthcare?
everybody I talk to want to talk about healthcare.
Okay, so give me an actual person's example. Okay.
Yeah, yeah. I'll just say this. I was talking to somebody in a trailer court who his wife has Parkinson's disease, and has no health insurance. And so like it's actually just kind of breaking the family's, financial back in terms of getting their, actually getting the health, services needed, making decisions around what health to skip, and just say like, we're going to have to get by with that. But also, doesn't make a low enough amount of money to get like on public, any kind of like Medicaid or anything like that. So also stuck in kind of a bubble, or not a bubble, but like a catch-22 in terms of that. And so just frustrated with navigating the system, don't know how to navigate it. I think kind of looking for leadership. And at the same time, like, it's not like, most folks are like studying the current debate in the Democratic Party around healthcare. Maybe people have heard the frame Medicare for all, but, people, most folks aren't tuned in at the level that a lot of people that we talk to are, at least not yet. So,
Did you find any
actually,
people who were really happy with their health insurance?
we didn't run into those people. Yeah. We must have knocked on the wrong doors, I think. So, but different, just, a range of stories, but it's apparently everybody's got one, that's what's happening right now. And I will say, like, I didn't see that. I would have not guessed 3 or 4 years ago. Like, I wouldn't have guessed before the ACA repeal battle, healthcare would be both such a kind of top of mind issue. But right now, what I think is like definitely like a winning for the Democratic Party, I think sees it as a winning issue for them. And that certainly didn't look like the case in the backlash to the ACA that led to the Tea Party taking over. So it's been a.
So you've had these conversations and you see how the conversation is playing out on the Democratic debates and the messaging that Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders and what have you are putting out. Are they tapping the pulse really? Are the conversations you're having reflecting anything that is missing in the national conversation?
Is it reflecting anything that's missing? I'm not sure. No, I think people are, it's not uniform, you know what I mean? People's experiences aren't uniform, but they're kind of uniformly bad. And so I think that people are glad that healthcare is like being discussed in the Democratic Party. The people that are tuned in, our members who are more tuned in and kind of, tracking politics, are glad there. And I think we find a significant base of support that is for an idea like Medicare for all. But I think we also see that there's been clearly lots of disinformation, and people, we talked to people that it seemed they had clearly seen one of these ads that, the Partnership for America's Healthcare Future, is running. So you could actually see where people were like, would mirror back the talking points from either Fox News or those ads. But I think, like, we have almost no members. We have lots of members that don't work on our healthcare campaign, but want our healthcare campaign to succeed.
Okay, so we need to take another brief break.
Yeah, sure.
Now, a little 10-second pause. And my guest is George Goehl. He's the director of the People's Action and People's Action Institute, a federation of community-based organizations across the country, working in rural and urban America to bring economic and racial justice. So what can listeners do? I mean, if they wanted to get involved with the kind of work you're doing, maybe going out into rural areas, how does that work? How do you do it? How do you go to these rural areas? Do you get a motel and stay there for a couple of days? Is it a day trip? How can people who want to do this get involved?
Yeah, great question. I mean, it's definitely, just to be clear, I don't want to jump past this. Like in all of these places, we are in the community. We have people from the community anchoring the local Down Home North Carolina, Iowa CCI, Citizen Action of Wisconsin. There are people in the community that help these organizations go day in and day out.
So maybe if somebody listening to this wants to work through you, you can help refer them to a local community, or they can go to your website and look for the local activism group that is affiliated through you at peoplesaction.org.
Exactly. And see, is there a group in my state? And then from there, could email. We have a general way for people to contact us, and we can make a connection to that group in those states. I do think we want to run some big canvas days where people could come in. We've found there's a real resonance of either folks that left rural communities and moved to, urban centers and actually like feel like people are kind of writing off their community. We're finding a kind of base in urban America that feels like what we're doing at People's Action is right and wants to be a part of it. So some people are asking, can I come and stay there for a week and be part of one of these Canvas projects? Can I contribute money? What are the things I can do to help make this happen? Because I think a lot of people feel it's some of the most, important work that is happening, and has emerged since Trump was elected.
And are you seeing results? I mean, you've had these 10,000 conversations.
Yeah.
A lot of conversations. Are there results coming out of it?
Oh, sure. Let me give you some examples. I mean, the two kinds of results are like actual winning things, and actually winning things and building organizations that help people kind of make meaning. So I'm just going to do just Haywood County, North Carolina as one example. Wages were identified as a critical issue in the door knocking that happened there. One of the first things they were able to do, Down Home North Carolina did this, organized a campaign to win what we think might be the first rural living wage policy in the country. We're not sure. We've not been able to find another one. It affected the county workers there, and everybody got like a pay bump out of that. And then, so that, that's just an example of actually winning something, and pretty quickly did that in about 6 months' time.
Wow.
But then just as another story there, like people who maybe joined the organization and joined the campaign to win on that issue or another issue, harbored, actually would say dog whistle racism things or anti-immigrant things in meetings or in their kind of original conversations. And then the process of working with a more diverse group, a multiracial group, being part of an organization to try to understand and digest some of what people are hearing on TV or hearing out of Trump's mouth, like a number of people's kind of worldview, and been like, oh man, I chose to make the immigrants my enemy, but that's not the reason. The 7 migrants that moved to Haywood County isn't the reason my county's poor. It's the big corporations, and like you said, a lot of this big stuff. And I got snookered by focusing on the wrong folks, and I'm not going to let that happen anymore. So and that happens over and over and over. And we think this work, absent people becoming more conscious around race and immigration, we're falling short.
Okay, now give me that list again of the top 5 issues that you identified. Health first.
Healthcare, education, clean air and water, mental health and addiction, and jobs. And I can send you the report too that was in if you'd like to.
And jobs. Okay, so how do you translate conversations about this into votes?
Into votes, yeah. I mean, I will say we think first, I just want you to understand the spirit behind this work. Humanitarian first, like people are hurting, we should be there. If we're only going there for votes, there's something wrong in our intentions. Second, like we want to figure out how to build multiracial
I like that.
democracy. And then third, elections matter. Just to be clear on that's kind of our operating framework. And I mean, it moves
I
into vote.
really, actually, I have to say, I really like that. That's about compassion and caring, and yeah,
Thanks.
that's bottom up too. That
Thanks.
is what, my philosophy about bottom up is we evolved to be bottom up. We evolved
Mm,
before civilization, living in hunter-gatherer small groups, and everybody took care of each other. And we've lost that.
yeah,
And it's starting to come back. And what you're doing is the kind of thing that helps to bring it back. And I think
yeah,
that's what we need to show people, that we are bringing to them, that and then we have to have candidates who reflect that as well.
yeah. I appreciate you noticing it because it's a decision. And if we're just viewing people as a path to get to 50 plus one, like there's something soulless about that and just doesn't feel right. And so, but we think, we do think we think the main part of this work, the most important part of this work is people being seen and feeling seen and heard. And people do not feel that. I think people don't feel that in poor urban communities, struggling inner ring suburbs, and in rural communities. But we want people to feel seen and heard. Um, and we want to help people make meaning of the moment. And we think we've not been engaged in the last 30 years in rural communities and helping people make meaning of what's really been, kind of suddenly Trump gets elected and everybody's like, oh, rural America's on fire. And it's like the decline has been happening in a lot of communities and a lot of industrial communities for decades. And I think a lot of the kind of more mainstream population just starting to pay attention. But in helping people think through how did we get there, we've seen, a number of people start to move on voting. We saw the dynamic around single rural white women and young white people. But we do think we got to stick there and be in the community and a constant presence for the long haul. And anybody that thinks this is going to result in massive shift in how people vote because we showed up for 6 months or a year, I think, is sorely mistaken.
Well, one of the things I've learned is systems theory and chaos
Mm-hmm.
theory. And in chaos theory, there are cycles and things change, and they can
Mm-hmm.
happen really, really fast. If you have a conversation with one person and you touch them and you connect with them and you build a bond with them, you don't know what kind of an effect that can have on how they connect with all the other people in their
Mm-hmm.
family and their community and their church and their business. And that one conversation can have a huge effect. And what it really makes me think is you don't want to just knock on doors and hand out literature.
Right.
You
Oh,
don't
yeah.
want to do that. That is not the way to do it. You want to sit down and talk to people and connect with them. And like, you said the most important thing is for people to feel like they're being seen. And connection is something that most people are in a state of deprivation right now. And they've lost their sense of connection to their community, to nature, to so much. And by having these front porch conversations you're having, it really is I think an incredibly powerful yet simple thing
Yeah.
that can make all the difference in the world, really.
Yeah. I
So
think you're right. And just having just been inspired by this last trip I took to the States I mentioned, just the number of people, and I mean, it's super high percentage that would stay on the porch with us for 20 minutes. I mean, and people maybe didn't know that was what was going to happen when we first knocked on the door, but I think, and because of a lot of the listening, that there was so much listening and sharing, and non-judgmental listening. The canvassers that are doing a lot of this work, one of them wrote a poem that was referred to themselves as a pack of empaths, because they're just going out and listening and not being judgmental, and just starting where people are at. And our kind of whole theory is it's not where people start, it's where we finish. And kind of just having faith in humanity is like the kind of core principle of this kind of door knocking.
I'm interviewing later this week Franz de Waal, who's an expert on primates and how they get along.
Hmm.
And they do all this stuff.
Right, right, right.
chimps and apes and bonobos and gorillas, they all treat each other better than so many humans treat each other. And all we need to do is start treating each other the way the primates treat each other. And
Yeah.
we,
Yeah.
but but I want to get a little more detail. So you're sending these people out. What kind of coaching do you give them on how to have these conversations, how to initiate them, how to get in the door, how to get to stay on the porch and turn and kind of open up the
Mhm.
conversation?
Yeah. Just, I mean, a lot of the people doing the conversations came out of an early round of conversations. You know what I mean? So they were people who we first did as part of these 10,000, got involved in the organization in an effort to like change some. Wait, I gotta. Sorry, I don't know what that was. I've not figured out how to turn that off.
You were just saying a lot of people who got into this were involved in
Yeah, let
earlier.
me go. I'll start there. Yeah, a lot of people that got involved in the doing the door knocking and the canvassing came in through the earlier rounds of door knocking and canvassing, got involved in local work to change something, and then felt like, wow, this is a place I want to invest in, a kind of organization I want to be a part of. And then people are really trained around how to do specifically these kind of conversations that take a kind of radical empathy, a non-judgmental listening, starting where people are at. And so we do training, and then every night there's more training. So like every night people go out, we run
Radical empathy and what else?
radical empathy, non-judgmental listening, starting where people are at.
So what does that mean? I mean, for people listening who want to start thinking about doing this, what is radical empathy?
I think it's like, even if somebody disagrees with you or says something that that you disagree with or you think is wrong, like we just stay empathetic, because everybody we're talking to is suffering in some way, and whether that's economically, socially, health wise, kind of the lack of connection that you mentioned earlier, like we just kind of focus on that. And if somebody says something that like maybe is a little off or not something that would really be accepted in our household, like that's not our job to deal with that right now. We're going to try to build a connection and understand somebody. Now, as we build relationship over time, will say like, we think you're actually kind of missing something here around something around race or immigration, and we want to talk with you about that. But you can't have that conversation if you don't have trust, and if you actually don't feel if you don't feel the person's pain and care about it, like I don't know how you're going to build a relationship where you're able to start to have a real hard conversation with somebody.
So the first step is to just get people to talk and to listen a lot.
Yeah. It's funny. It's like in a day where everybody wants a, cool trick that you can scale to figure out how to solve our problems, and like, or wants an app or something like that. We think, this is a time, you still just got to go out and talk to people. And I don't know how we heal this country if we don't go out and talk to each other and listen to each other. And so, yeah.
I think that, it makes me think of a couple of things. It makes me think of Native Americans. They have a talking circle with a talking stick, and the person
Hmm.
holding the stick gets the chance to talk, and everybody else is quiet while that person has the stick.
Yeah.
And I get criticized for interrupting my guests, but I think I probably give my guests 95% of the time of an
Yeah.
hour that I'm doing here. And
Yeah.
I try to kind of focus things a little bit, but you're the one giving the information really, and I really
Right.
appreciate
I know
that.
it's similar. What's happening here is what we need more of everywhere. Yeah.
Yeah. And I also think about Paulo Freire, Pedagogy of the
Hmm.
Oppressed. I mean, the oppressed have to learn that they are oppressed. They don't always even know. How do you deal with that? How do you wake them up and get them to take their power?
Well, yeah, I was gonna say, I think, yeah. I mean, on the power thing, I think a lot of people, um, you know, generations, a lifetime have taught people, that they don't have power. People feel like a lack of agency in the world, and have lots of both kind of external limits on people's power, but also internal questioning of our relevancy and our power in the world. So I think the most important thing we do in our training is help people figure out kind of what messages that society have sent to them that we've all internalized, that say like, I'm not good enough, I'm not effective enough, I'm not the kind of person that does that stuff, and like try to like uncover that and figure out how to deal with it. Otherwise, we think we're just leaving a lot of power on the table, and people are not able to develop into their full selves. And it's something we do. We have a week-long training that people go through. And, many people find it to be revelatory in terms of having really not actually spent a lot of time kind of meditating on ways they're limiting their own impact in the world. So it's an important part of, of what we do here.
All right, then we need a wrap.
Yeah.
Helping people find their power. I like that. So my guest for this show has been George Goehl. He's the director of People's Action Institute at peoplesaction.org. Thanks so much for being on the show.
Thank you. It was great talking. I appreciate it.